Thank you, Madam Speaker. This Wednesday, Bell Media announced that it was consolidating its newsrooms across the country, laying off 1,300 people. Gone from the company are two names that those in the parliamentary precinct will know well: Joyce Napier, who was CTV's Ottawa bureau chief, and Glenn McGregor, who was CTV's senior political correspondent. CTV will be closing its international bureaus in London and Los Angeles and scaling back its Washington bureau. The company is also closing 6 of its radio stations, including Edmonton's beloved sports talk station, TSN 1260. The station had been on the air in various guises and genres since 1927, a legacy of community service spanning almost a century. Then yesterday morning, poof, it was gone. These shocking new cuts are just the latest in a long and painful litany of media meltdowns. All across the country, our newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and TV stations are fighting to stay alive in the wake of seismic digital disruption that eroded advertising revenues, subsumed subscription sales, and ruptured relationships with readers and audiences. In the face of this crisis, we have before us Bill C-18, which holds forth what I fear is a false and illusory promise of media renewal. Now, you may not understand why I, a person who spent 30 years working as a journalist, do not support Bill C-18. So let me be as clear as possible. This bill is not a plebiscite on the importance of journalism, nor on the value of a free press. It should be starkly evident by now that Canadian journalism is in crisis, and that this crisis is having a dire impact on our democracy and our society. And if I thought this bill would save Canadian journalism, it would have my full-throated support. But it can't, and it won't. In a year where Everything Everywhere All at Once won the Oscar for Best Picture, and where Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is the hit of the summer, it's hard to ignore the lure of multiverse metaphors. So let's look at 2 possible outcomes of Bill C-18. In one timeline, it's possible both Meta and Google will make good on their threats and block access to Canadian news. Imagine Canadians are suddenly unable to read or share news on Facebook or Instagram, which are 2 of Canada's most popular social media sites. Imagine that suddenly you can't share a story with your neighbors about a hostage taking in your neighborhood, or less dramatically, about plans for a high-rise tower at the end of your block. Imagine that you can't share a story about Donald Trump's latest legal woes with your cousins, nor a story about wildfire smoke with your mother-in-law who has emphysema, nor a restaurant review from your local paper with your friend the foodie. Meta has signaled its intent to block all news, including international news, the day C-18 is given royal assent. That wouldn't just impinge on our ability to keep ourselves and our friends informed, it would undermine the ability of news publishers to post and share their stories, to attract audiences, and to serve advertisers. It would reduce readership and revenues overnight, leaving Canadian publishers and broadcasters worse off than before. And if Google stops surfacing Canadian and international news stories on its mighty site, well, the effects would be even more dire. Google curates the world. 90% of the globe uses Google as its search engine, an outrageous and dangerous monopoly that no country, including Canada, has truly challenged. Although the European Union is trying, having just launched a major antitrust action against the search giant this very week. If Google stops indexing us, well, suddenly, for millions and millions of Canadians who rely on Google, all news stories would just quietly disappear. And we wouldn't even know what we're not seeing. Our reality will just shift in ways we cannot imagine or anticipate. Indeed, many Canadians who, I hate to break it to you, have not been glued to the C-18 debate might not even realize that their news just zip, vanished. Not perhaps until we face some kind of public emergency or health crisis or political upheaval, and they suddenly find themselves in the dark without vital information they need for themselves and their families. According to Statistics Canada figures released just this past March, a full 80% of Canadians get their news online. 90% of those with university degrees rely on the internet as their primary news source. As for Canadians between 15 and 34, well, 95% of them rely on the internet as their primary source of news. And if Google and Facebook suddenly start blocking our access to our news, which will be their legal right as private American companies, then we'll all be cut off from the news. And Canadian journalists will be cut off from readers and viewers, reporting stories that no one can find. At least that's scenario one. It may not happen. Just, one hypothetical. Donc, let's look at scenario two. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Facebook and Google are simply bluffing, that they are making empty threats and have neither the technical capacity nor the political guts to do anything so drastic. So let's assume that after some huffing and puffing, they concede and enter into negotiations with Canadian news outlets and agree to subsidize Canadian journalism to the tune of, say, $300 million a year to pay for 25 or 30 or even 35% of the cost of Canadian newsrooms. Well, you may say, if that happens, then C-18 will have done its job, Senator Simons. But it's not that simple. What happens if formerly independent Canadian news organizations become utterly beholden to Google and Meta for their survival? What happens if we give these two American behemoths even more control over what we read and watch and hear? And we've already had a taste of this. Because in an effort to head off C-18, both Google and Facebook have been busy striking secret side deals with major publishers across the country. Read a story about C-18 in the media right now, and you will quite often see a little note at the bottom of the page informing you that the media outlet is already receiving some form of compensation through a private agreement with one of the big social media giants. It will then be left to you to judge whether that subsidy has had any impact on the way the story about Google or Facebook was reported. Just the other day, someone asked me why Bill C-18 has received so much less media attention than Bill C-11. I fear the answer is self-evident. Some, though perhaps not all, Canadian publishers, large and small, have pulled their punches and engaged in self-censorship, whether consciously or unconsciously. And who could blame them? Bite the hand that feeds you too hard, and you could end up with a punch in the nose. So now, imagine just how independently and freely news might be reported if Facebook and Google held the purse strings in a stranglehold. But you don't have to imagine. Dr. Sarah Bannerman, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Communication Policy and Governance at McMaster University, has painted some ideas. In her brief to the Standing Senate Committee on Transportation and Communication, she notes that there is nothing in Bill C-18 that prevents the growing influence of digital platforms over news coverage. Companies such as Google and Meta, Dr. Bannerman notes, could provide remuneration to news organizations in the form of training, technical support, technologies, or technological licensing discounts. That sounds fine, but that in turn, she writes, would deepen the integration of news organization with digital platform data and technologies. Let me quote from her brief. Such technologies could not only allow data and information about users and news to flow back to platforms, the bill makes no mention of privacy, but it also shapes how newsrooms view and evaluate their own activities. The door is open for platforms to invest in specific capital or projects rather than or as well as paying cash. This would result in platforms gaining influence over the structure and infrastructure of news organizations and the content they produce, end quote. Indeed, I would argue Facebook and Google have already had a direct and detrimental impact on the way newsrooms present their stories, whether it was because Facebook enthusiastically insisted that newspapers pivot to video, which largely turned out to be a waste of time and resources and talent, or whether it was because Google led newsrooms to rewrite and torture leads and headlines in a vain attempt to search engine optimize their stories. I can only imagine how much more direct that kind of influence might become in a regime where Facebook and Google are underwriting the news. Let me quote again from Sarah Bannerman. Quote, allowing platforms' business models to potentially shape news in this way can be bad for news quality. It can result in newsrooms pursuing clicks and platform incentives rather than stories and formats that are important to an informed electorate and citizenry, end quote. Now, we certainly tried in committee to make small amendments to make C-18 less damaging. I myself was quite disappointed when, by a narrow margin, the committee defeated my own amendment, which strove to make Google and Facebook more accountable for the way they use their algorithms to boost some news stories and suppress others. I sought to model my amendment on the data transparency protocols, which have recently been embraced by the European Union, to no avail, I'm afraid. I did have one other tiny amendment passed, which simply removed the phrase, such as a section of a newspaper, from Clause 2. This, by the way, was passed unanimously. I fear that Senator Housakis, in the rush today, may have confused me with my good friend, Senator Clément, who did indeed propose an amendment that did indeed have an impact on Indigenous news reporting, although it broadened the scope rather than narrowed it. But that was her amendment, not mine. And perhaps when Senator Housakis is back from his little walk, sorry, I'm not allowed to say that, perhaps Senator Housakis will be able to offer an apology at an appropriate date to both myself and Senator Clément. My colleague Senator Dasco, however, was successful with a far more important amendment, which allowed media companies who do not wish to be part of the C-18 regime to opt out. Originally, the CRTC had the power to order companies to be part of deal-making with Google and Facebook, even if they didn't want to do so. And I'm glad to say that Senator Dasco was able to make that important change. Another critical amendment was proposed by our Deputy Chair, Senatrice Deschênes. Her amendment aims to create a solid framework for negotiations between platforms and news organizations based on a legitimate exchange of value, giving arbitrators some functional rubric to adjudicate. The amendment attempts to inject some economic common sense into the airy fantasy of C-18. But even though the amendment was accepted by the committee, the government opposed it, and I greatly fear it may not survive. So what are we left with? Not a bill that saves Canadian media, but a bill that leaves us impotent and at the mercy of the whims of Alphabet and Meta, two slightly sclerotic giants who are both facing economic stresses all their own. And my friends, it breaks my heart. The government had so many other things it could have done. Suppose it had stopped buying so many millions of dollars in ads on Facebook and Google and spent some of that money instead buying ads in local newspapers and ethnocultural, Indigenous, and minority language publications. Suppose it had broadened its tax rebate program and rewarded Canadians directly for subscribing to newspapers and magazines. Suppose, as one of our witnesses, independent writer and publisher Jen Gerson of The Line suggested, they had simply given more money to the CBC and thus allowed the public broadcaster to stop selling ads and stop competing with newspapers and private broadcasters for advertising revenue. Instead, we have invested so much time and energy and political capital on this weird Rube Goldberg device of a bill, which may completely backfire, or which may undermine the independence and integrity of Canadian news if it works at all. I got my first professional full-time job as a reporter in March of 1988 when I was 23 years old. I worked full-time as a journalist until October of 2018 when I was appointed to the Senate. Indeed, I still write a bi-monthly column for Alberta Views magazine and host my own monthly political podcast, Alberta Unbound. My entire adult life has been made up of newsprint, ink, and radio waves. Journalism was and is my life. And in my Senate office, I have a bookshelf full of National Newspaper Award certificates to suggest it was a life fairly well lived. What has happened to the news industry in my city, my province, and my nation doesn't just break my heart, it guts me, and it makes me fear for the health of our democracy and our society. Now, I hope against hope that I am absolutely and spectacularly wrong about Bill C-18. I hope, I really do, that it works and that its success makes me look like a cynical old fool. Instead, my friends, I have rarely felt more like Cassandra, the Trojan princess who was blessed with the power of prophecy and cursed with the inability to make anybody hear or believe her. Thank you. Merci. Hi, hi.